Hello everyone, and welcome back to Scary Interesting. In this video, we're going to go over 3 cases of people or groups of people who met their ends at the hands of some unknown person in an extremely disturbing way. And more than decades later, each of these cases is still completely unsolved. As a warning, although the events in this video are fleeting and non-descriptive, they are still highly disturbing, so viewer discretion is strongly advised. On the evening of December 12th, 1985, a 2-year-old child was found standing by herself outside a Kmart in Spanaway, Washington. When she was approached by a concerned shopper and asked where her mother was, her only reply was, "Mommy is in the trees." Unfortunately, the girl was too young to describe anything beyond that might help police determine who she was or where her parents were, so she was placed in temporary foster care while authorities appealed to the public to identify her. And in fact, watching a news report a few days later, Louise Conrad was stunned to see her granddaughter's face on the television screen. She notified the police right away and picked her up, but their reunion then revealed the troubling disappearance of her parents, 36-year-old Mike Reimer and his 21-year-old girlfriend, Diana Robertson. So the next and even bigger question was, where had they gone and why did they leave their daughter behind? A tragic answer would come on February 18th, 1986, when Mike's truck was found in the woods just south of Elbe, Washington. In the woods, a man was walking his dog when he found the truck, and next to the truck, Diana was lying face down with 17 stab wounds covering her body and a tube sock knotted tightly around her neck. There also wasn't a single sign of Mike anywhere. Police would later learn that the couple, along with their daughter, had come out to the forest looking for a Christmas tree. Mike was also an animal trapper, so this was also an occasion for him to check his traps. As soon as family and friends of the couple learned they were missing, they traced Mike's known trap line while police covered the search from air. But for 2 months afterward, efforts to find them were completely useless until that dog walker found the truck and Diana's body. From that moment, Mike's absence made him a person of interest in Diana's death, but with a 2-month head start, he could be pretty much anywhere. At the scene of the truck as well, police found bloodstains on the interior, but the samples were so degraded after sitting there for about 10 weeks that the lab couldn't even determine a blood type, let alone who it belonged to. And as if that wasn't enough of a dead end, police found a manila envelope on the dashboard of the truck, and scrawled on it was a note that read, "I love you, Diana." Despite Louise's insistence that the handwriting was identical to the other notes and cards Mike had written to Diana, police sent the envelope off to the FBI for analysis. This case was then assigned to Detective David Nizer, and he expected it to come back as a match for Mike's handwriting. But strangely, when the analysis was done, the FBI felt that the comparison was inconclusive. This was the majority of the evidence David had to work with, and with this revelation, he was at a bit of a loss. There were still far more questions than answers, so with nowhere else to turn, he started looking into other known crimes in the area. This is when he came across an interesting case in Pierce County. 4 months before Mike and Diana went missing on August 10th, 1985, 27-year-old Stephen Harkins and 42-year-old Ruth Cooper had come to Tule Lake for a weekend camping trip. But then, when neither of them showed up for work the following Monday, police were notified. Initial searches of the area turned up nothing, but on August 14th, several hikers came upon a campsite. On the ground, still inside a sleeping bag, was Stephen with a bullet wound on his forehead. He had clearly been killed while he slept during the camping trip. Near the campsite as well, police found the couple's dog, which had died the same way. Ruth, however, was still missing. As that October came to a close, the Pierce County Sheriff's Department received a call about possible human remains near Tule Lake. When investigators arrived, they found a skull about 1.5 miles from Stephen and Ruth's campsite. These were then analyzed using dental records, and it was determined that it did indeed belong to Ruth. An autopsy initially only determined that her cause of death was homicidal violence, but a Pierce County spokesperson would later report that Ruth died of a gunshot wound to the abdomen. These details David learned about the case of Stephen and Ruth were interesting enough already, but then he came across one piece of evidence that seemed too unlikely to be a coincidence. Found tied tightly around Ruth's neck was a tube sock. Much like he had treated the handwriting on the envelope, he didn't want to jump to any conclusions until he was absolutely sure he had a clear picture of the facts. But in the back of his head, he feared they might be searching for a serial offender. This is what prompted him to reach out to the Pierce County about his hunch. On his visit to the sheriff's office, David brought with him the tube sock that was tied around Diana's neck, and he had it placed on the table in the evidence room. When the Pierce County Sheriff's Department staff member located the box containing the evidence from Stephen and Ruth's case, he brought the box over to where David was sitting and dumped the contents onto the table. A tube sock inside an evidence bag then spilled out in front of both of them, and at first sight, a chill went down David's spine and he could feel the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Both socks were tied using the exact same knot. He was by then almost certain that the person responsible for Diana's murder was also Stephen and Ruth's killer, which also left him with two possibilities. Either Mike was a fourth victim and his body just hadn't been located yet, or Mike killed Diana and potentially Stephen and Ruth as well. Diana's body and Mike's truck were found just 15 miles from the general location where Stephen and Ruth were found, and Stephen and Ruth were also discovered where Mike was known to set his animal traps. At this point, it seemed like either scenario could have been just as likely as the next, but those who were close to Diana revealed a lot about Mike. According to Diana's family and friends, as well as police reports, Mike had a long history of being physically aggressive towards Diana, and he didn't just keep it too physical either. Mike was also mentally manipulative. When the case was featured on the TV show Unsolved Mysteries, Diana's sister claimed that Mike would see other women, but he would then turn this around on Diana and allege that she was seeing other men. And somehow he would find a way to justify this type of gaslighting. Diana even told her mother Louise that Mike had told her very pointedly that he was going to kill her one day and that he was confident he could get away with it. When Diana finally had enough of Mike's actions, she went to the police and filed a restraining order against him, and a warrant was issued for his arrest. It seemed like she was going to do all she could to escape what was clearly a dangerous relationship for her. But tragically, a few weeks before she was killed, Diana decided to give Mike another chance, and the couple reunited. Unfortunately, the case of the tube sock killings, as they became known, went completely cold afterward as efforts to locate Mike were unsuccessful, and more than 25 years would pass from the time he went missing before anything else was found. On March 26, 2011, several hikers were making their way through an area just 1 mile from where Diana's body was discovered decades earlier when they came across a partial human skull. Police were then called to the scene, and an analysis of dental records in the days that followed determined that these were all that remained of Mike. A search of the area didn't turn up the rest of the body, and as of 2024, it has still never been located. Because of this, medical examiners can't determine his exact cause of death, but at the very least, no wounds to the head were found. So, as strange as it is, this is where the case still stands today as of the publishing of this video. What we know is that in 1985, two separate couples were killed within 4 months of one another. They were each also killed within 15 miles of one another, and in each of the cases, the female victim had a tube sock tied around their neck. And beyond what we know, there are some puzzling things to consider. Like, for example, was Mike involved, or was he simply a victim? And how did Mike and Diana's daughter end up at the Kmart unharmed? Unfortunately, all David and the family members of the victims have been left with to date are these questions and not much else. On June 23, 1965, Edwina Rogers' nephew called the Houston police and asked if they'd send officers to her home on Driscoll Street to do a quick safety check. He was concerned about his aunt because he'd been calling for days and neither she nor his uncle had picked up the phone even once. This was strange because one of them was almost always home. Weirdly, when the officers arrived to check on them, one of the couple's cars was still in the driveway. They then banged on the door and announced their presence in loud voices, but nobody ever met them at the front door. They also walked around the house, tapping on the windows, but they couldn't see inside because all the curtains were drawn. Still not really suspecting anything bad though, they figured the couple were at work, on vacation, or just out running errands. But before leaving, their spirits told them to break down the door and enter the home just to make sure Fred and Edwina weren't sick, injured, or dead. After kicking in the door, they found that the living room was neat and orderly, and there were no signs that there'd been a struggle or a burglary or anything like that. The house was clearly empty, but they found plates of food on the table that didn't look like they'd been there for very long. It was as if the couple mysteriously vanished just before sitting down to a meal. Then, more out of nosiness and curiosity than anything else, one officer decided to look in the refrigerator. In it, he found that the shelves were stacked with large chunks of fresh meat that looked like pork. He immediately assumed that Fred or Edwina had recently bought it from a local butcher shop because it looked remarkably fresh. The officer was just about to close the refrigerator door when he glanced down at the vegetable crisper, and horrifyingly, just a few feet away between his knees and ankles, he saw two heads looking up at him through the thin glass partition. This immediately changed the visit. Now with two murders on their hands, the officers radioed in and began searching the house more thoroughly than they had before. They eventually found a faint blood trail leading down the hallway to a bedroom. There was even a drop of blood on the door near the keyhole, but when they opened the door, the empty bedroom looked perfectly pristine. Investigators quickly determined that the heads belonged to the homeowners, and so did what was found in the refrigerator. And later, officers found even more when a neighbor called to report an unpleasant odor coming from the storm drain outside her home. Apparently, whoever had done this also flushed some of it down the toilet. As if this wasn't already horrifying enough, during the autopsies, it was determined that Fred had been killed by blunt force trauma. Then after that, his eyes and his lower regions were removed purposefully. Edwina, on the other hand, seems to have gone through something a little more prolonged before eventually being shot. Needless to say, it looked like whoever had done this held some deep-seated animosity toward each of the victims. The medical examiner also concluded that whoever did it was someone with professional-grade knife skills and a keen knowledge of human anatomy. This incident soon came to be known as the Icebox Murders and made front-page news across the country, but the gruesome case actually turned out to be even more mysterious than anyone could have imagined. In the early going, investigators weren't sure if anyone else lived with Fred and Edwina Rogers in their home on Driscoll Street. However, relatives would later say that their 44-year-old son Charles had been staying with them at the time of their deaths. And obviously, since he was conspicuously absent when their bodies were found, he immediately became a prime suspect. City, state, and nationwide searches were eventually launched, but no trace of him was ever found, and he has never been found to this day. Now, this might have been the end of the story, but the case took a number of bizarre twists when investigators began looking into Charles's background. We don't know much about his childhood, but by most accounts, Fred and Edwina Rogers weren't exactly candidates for Parents of the Year. Fred was supposedly a bookie, gambler, and petty criminal, and he and Edwina allegedly were not very good to Charles, both physically and emotionally, from a very young age. Despite this, Charles was an exceptionally bright kid with big dreams and a promising future. He also had a ton of interests that include everything from history and geology to ham radios and foreign languages. After high school, he attended Texas A&M University before transferring to the University of Houston. He then graduated with a degree in nuclear physics, and afterward, he promptly enlisted in the US Navy. He eventually got his pilot's wings and served during the Second World War, but later he joined the Office of Naval Intelligence. It's not clear exactly what he did, but the fact that he became fluent in half a dozen foreign languages seems to indicate that he was being trained for some type of overseas assignment. Whatever it actually was, Charles's connection to naval intelligence is important. There's an old saying that goes something like, once a CIA agent, always a CIA agent. This is relevant to Charles's case because, according to some sources, he actually worked for the CIA during his time with naval intelligence. However, after the war, he left the Navy and began working as a seismologist for several petroleum exploration companies, including Shell Oil. There, Charles apparently had an uncanny knack for finding oil deposits that his older and more experienced colleagues missed. And while his job kept him busy, he had enough free time to pursue personal interests, and he met a few interesting and historically significant characters along the way, one of which was an alleged Kennedy assassination co-conspirator. Then, in the mid-50s, Charles abruptly left Shell Oil. This is another oddity because a few months later, at the age of 44, he was back living in his parents' home on Driscoll Street in Houston. This decision to move back in with his not-so-nice parents is open to multiple interpretations, but it might indicate that he had no other options. If that is the case, it's strange that he didn't have enough money to live independently after working as a well-paid seismologist for so many years. On the other hand, the move may have been part of a long simmering plan to repay them for a lifetime of ill treatment, but again, this is just speculation. Whatever the case, the not-so-nice behavior picked up where it left off years before, and Charles's mother may have made the situation even worse by repeatedly stealing her son's money. During this time, Charles became a recluse. He rarely left his bedroom, and instead of communicating with his parents verbally, he slipped handwritten notes under the door when he was hungry or had something important to tell them. Even more strangely, neighbors noticed that he usually left home before sunrise and that he rarely returned before 8 or 9, and sometimes he didn't show up until much later. And since there's no record of Charles being employed during this period, the questions are, where did he go every day, and more importantly, what did he do? Now, before we get into this next part, I just want to mention that I typically don't really entertain conspiracy theories, but I've included them here because they're both interesting and this case is just so strange. Anyways, according to at least one controversial source, Charles and a number of co-conspirators were busy planning the attempt on President John F. Kennedy. Much of Charles's life found its way into the 1992 book The Man on the Grassy Knoll. And according to the authors, he'd been a CIA agent since his days in the Naval Intelligence. The authors also contend that Charles murdered his parents because he found out that his mother had been listening in on his phone calls while he was living in their home. At the same time, while nearly everyone agrees that Charles had something to do with his parents' deaths, many argued that it had nothing to do with anything beyond that. Instead, they claimed that the murders were simply payback for years of mistreatment that continued well into Charles's 40s. And in fact, he was never charged with his parents' deaths even after his disappearance, and critics of the more outlandish theories claim that there's very little evidence to support any of them. Whatever the case, Charles never resurfaced in the United States. There are multiple eyewitnesses that have claimed to have seen him in Honduras and other South American countries in the mid-1960s, but again, none of these have been corroborated. So, unfortunately, whatever the true case, Charles was officially declared dead in the summer of 1975, and the abandoned house on Driscoll Street was eventually demolished. Vampires have had a place in popular culture for hundreds of years. These human-like creatures that are said to stalk the night in search of blood are fascinating, which is maybe why there have been hundreds of novels, movies, and television shows throughout the years that feature them as central characters. The most iconic among them is Bram Stoker's Dracula, which was published in 1897, and the character of Dracula was partially inspired by the real-life Romanian ruler from the 15th century named Vlad Tepes, who was better known as Vlad the Impaler. Stories still circulate today about his brutality and how he supposedly routinely drank the blood of his enemies. And while it's true that he had no mercy for his opposition and that his favored method of getting rid of his enemies was by impaling them on large stakes, much about him has been exaggerated over the centuries. Interestingly though, beyond Vlad the Impaler, seemingly every culture around the world features stories of blood-sucking spirits or entities thought to be the basis for the modern-day vampire. Like for example, even Greek mythology has a vampire origin story. As the story goes, an Italian man named Ambrosio traveled to Delphi, Greece, and while there he fell in love with a woman named Selene. Unfortunately, she also happened to be the love interest of the sun god Apollo. In learning of their relationship, Apollo put a curse on Ambrosio that caused his skin to become severely burnt if exposed to sunlight. To break the curse, Ambrosio went to Hades, the god of the underworld, but Hades sent him on an errand in order to earn his freedom from the curse. This mission that he was sent on was to steal the silver bow of Artemis, the goddess of wild animals. While on this journey to find Artemis and capture the silver bow, Ambrosio wrote to Selene every day, only he had no pen or ink. So every day for 44 days he killed a swan and used its blood and feathers to write his love. This dedication impressed Artemis so much that she granted him immortality and the ability to live off the blood of humans, and thus Ambrosio became the very first vampire. Vampire stories like this have been timeless, and different offshoots and interpretations of them are too numerous to name, but in the end, they're all just stories, right? In early May of 1932, 35-year-old Minnie Jansen was in her apartment when she heard a pounding at her door. And although she wasn't expecting anyone, she knew exactly who was waiting for her on the other side of the door. Just like she suspected, she opened the door, and standing there without any clothes was Lily Lindström. Minnie and Lily were so-called ladies of the night in Sweden, but neither one of them walked the streets in hopes of attracting clientele. Instead, they were more like call girls who hosted clients in their respective apartments. Lily lived right upstairs from Minnie, and it was almost a running joke that Lily would show up at some point during the week to borrow contraceptives. She was always running out of them and seemed to forget to replenish her supply of them just as often. With a wry smile, Minnie handed one to Lily, who thanked her and went running back up the steps to her waiting client. Minnie couldn't help but laugh and shake her head as she shut and locked her front door. Minnie and Lily were also the types of friends who saw each other every day without fail, just by nature of their proximity, but also because they truly enjoyed each other's company. The two lived in a decent apartment building in the Swedish capital of Stockholm, and just adjacent to their building was a section called Sankt Eriksplan. This area had a reputation for being the home and workplace of many of the city's so-called night workers. It wasn't exactly the safest of areas, as assaults and murders were all too common there, but it was the place to be, considering their line of work. A couple days later, on May the 4th, Minnie grew more and more concerned when she hadn't seen Lily or heard any noise coming from her apartments for several days. As such good friends, the two looked out for one another, and Minnie wasn't about to wait around any longer to see if Lily turned up. After several attempts to find her, Minnie called the police to report Lily missing. When police arrived outside Lily's apartment, they tried knocking a few times, but there wasn't even the slightest sound coming from inside the apartment. So, after giving her ample opportunity to answer, police decided to break in. With one hard, swift kick, the door flew open, and inside, officers were met with an absolutely brutal scene. Lily was found in her bedroom, lying face down, without clothing and with severe damage to the back of her head. Officers rushed to her sides in hopes that she was still alive, but it was already clear that she'd been dead for several days. It was also apparent that her death occurred during a meeting with a client, as a used piece of protection had been left protruding from her body. Next to it, her clothing had been neatly folded and placed in a chair. Parts of her body were also covered in dried saliva, namely her neck, and authorities noticed that there was a surprising lack of blood despite the horrific head wounds. But even more strangely, a more extensive examination of her body revealed that most of her blood had been removed, although a better word might be consumed. This discovery allowed investigators to connect the dots between her death and a strange piece of evidence that was also found in the bedroom near Lily's body. It was a blood-stained gravy ladle, and police theorized that the person used it to consume some or most of Lily's blood at the scene. They even entertained the idea that the person had a container of some kind that he used to take the rest of it with him too. In addition to that already being strange enough, no one in the building heard any sort of struggle coming from the apartment or the sounds of someone trying to make a getaway. The only tip-off that something was wrong was Lily's absence, and police had so little to go off based on what they knew of Lily and what they found at the scene. Had the crime taken place in modern times, the person almost certainly would have been identified and captured rather quickly. That's because whoever killed Lily left DNA everywhere at the crime scene. However, in the 1930s, people didn't even know what DNA was, and discovering it, let alone using it to solve cases, was still decades off. And although police did collect hair, saliva, and other samples, which were well preserved and are currently on display at the Swedish Police Museum, there was really nothing they could do with it at the time. The only way to solve this crime in 1932 was to use old-fashioned police work to find people and get verbal confessions. Unfortunately, this was also more complicated than usual. Because of her profession, Lily came across all sorts of men on a daily basis. She had her regulars, of course, and 9 of them were questioned by police, but all were cleared after the interviews took place. Additionally, there was a much greater chance that Lily could have come into contact with new clients unknown to her around this time. In the early 1930s, Sweden went through a Great Depression of its own as wages fell and unemployment skyrocketed. Most of Sweden's economy at the time was built on agriculture, and farmers were experiencing low crop yield. This drove people who lived in the country into larger cities like Stockholm to look for work, meaning there were many newcomers to the city. And it was already difficult enough for police to just find people who knew Lily through her line of work because Lily was such a common name in Sweden at the time. Essentially, the suspect pool was abnormally large and the evidence was abnormally scant. Lily's death and the strange scene found in her bedroom did get people talking though. Whether through gossip or police work, several theories were thrown around. The most popular among them was that Lily's killer was actually a police officer, although there was very little hard evidence to suggest this. This is because, in the eyes of investigators working the case, the relatively clean crime scene caused them to wonder whether the crime had been committed by someone who knew what police would be looking for. The public, however, had a much different theory. To many, this was the work of a real-life vampire. As strange and unlikely as this was, just the suggestion of it was almost enough to throw the country into hysteria. People believed the saliva found on her neck and the lack of blood at the scene was more than enough to prove Lily's killer was some kind of supernatural blood-sucking being. The public also pointed to the ladle as evidence of the theory's validity, but at the same time, there was never anything conclusive to indicate that the person even used the ladle to drink anything, despite it being stained with the blood. There was no question that it was used at some point between Lily's murder and the killer's departure, but how and why was anyone's guess. Interestingly, the public may have been onto something with their seemingly outlandish theory. It's pretty safe to say that vampires of legend don't exist in reality, but there is a known mental condition that causes people to believe they are actual vampires. This is called Reinfeldt syndrome, but it's more colloquially known as clinical vampirism. In psychiatric literature, references to patients having an obsession with drinking blood have been noted more than 50,000 times between 1892 and 2010, but the condition wasn't given a name until the 1980s. And although this may sound like a large number of cases, within the context of world population, it's actually an extremely rare condition. There are some known killers that seem to fit the profile for clinical vampirism, like Peter Curtin, the vampire of Dusseldorf from the 1920s, or Richard Chase, the vampire of Sacramento from the 1970s. And it's possible that Lily's killer suffered from the same mental affliction. But without the killer's identity, however, this is all conjecture at best. In the more than 90 years since Lily was killed so mysteriously, there have been no further developments in the case, and it remains unsolved to this day. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching. If you know of any other creepy, unsolved cases like the ones in today's video that you think might fit the channel, feel free to submit them to the form found in the description. And hopefully, I will see you in the next one.